For 3 years, every freight driver between Red Mesa and Alder Creek believed the same thing, that the wide, sun-baked flats of Dust Hollow were the only road worth taking. And for 3 years, every one of those drivers passed a thin trail along the canyon rim to the west and never looked twice at it. But there was a woman living along that rim, and she had been waiting. Stay with me. Norah Prescott arrived in Red Mesa in the spring of 1881, riding a dun mare with a sway back and a temperament like cold iron. Behind the mare, she pulled a 2-wheeled cart loaded with canvas sacks, a set of farrier's tools wrapped in oiled cloth, and a wooden crate that rattled when the wheels hit ruts. Beside the cart walked a dog, gray and rangy, with amber eyes and a chest like a barrel. She called him Dust. He had appeared one morning outside Fort Larkin, half-starved and full of burrs, and followed her 60 miles without once being invited. By the second day, she stopped trying to send him away. By the fourth, she was talking to him like he understood every word. Most people in Red Mesa paid her little attention. She was 26 years old, sun-dark from months on the trail, with hands roughened from work and a way of watching people that made them uncomfortable. She asked few questions and answered fewer. She had come from Silver Falls, Colorado, a mining town that had boomed for 2 years and gone quiet in 1. Her husband, Thomas Prescott, had worked the assay office there. He was careful, educated, and well-liked. People said he could look at a rock sample and tell you what was in it before the acid even touched the surface. He was the kind of man who noticed things, the way a hillside leaned, the way a creek changed color after rain, the way timber grew thick on one slope and thin on the next. He died of typhus in the winter of 1879, 3 days before Christmas, in a bed Norah had built herself from pine boards and rope. She was 24. She sat with him through the last 2 nights, pressing wet cloths to his forehead, while the wind screamed off the peaks and the stove ticked in the corner. When he stopped breathing, she didn't cry. She sat very still for a long time, holding his hand, feeling the warmth leave it. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went outside to feed the mule. Grief on the frontier was something you carried while you worked. There was no time to set it down. Thomas had taught her many things during their 3 years together: how to read a land survey, how to calculate grades and drainage, how to look at a piece of ground and understand where water would go when the sky opened up. He had learned these things from his father, a civil engineer who had mapped canal routes in Pennsylvania before the family moved west. The elder Prescott had believed that water was the key to understanding any landscape, and he had passed that belief to his son like a family Bible. "Water is honest," Thomas used to say. "It always goes where the ground tells it to go. You just have to learn to read the ground." Norah remembered that. After Thomas died, she sold the cabin and the mule and bought passage on a freight wagon heading south. She had heard about the new rail line being laid toward Alder Creek, and she knew what a rail town did to the land around it. It pulled people in. It made roads where there were none. And wherever roads appeared, someone had to own the ground beneath them. She did not arrive in Red Mesa with a plan to get rich. She arrived with a plan to survive. And she had been reading the ground the whole way down. Red Mesa sat on a low shelf of red sandstone at the edge of a wide basin that stretched south and east for 20 miles before rising into the dry highlands near Alder Creek. The basin was called Dust Hollow, and it was exactly what the name suggested: a flat, open stretch of pale dust and cracked clay that shimmered in the heat and looked, from any distance, like the easiest ground in the territory to cross. By the summer of 1881, the Alder Creek Rail Depot was nearly finished. Merchants in Red Mesa were already planning. Goods would need to move between the two towns: lumber, ore, dry goods, livestock feed, hardware. The fastest route was obvious: straight across the flats. A man named Garrett Loomis organized the first land purchases. Loomis was a supply merchant who had made his money selling picks and blasting powder to miners in the Sangre Hills, and he had a voice that carried across any room. He bought 3 parcels along the center of Dust Hollow and announced plans for a wagon depot and a supply warehouse. Others followed. Jonas Pettit, who ran the feed store, bought a strip near the eastern edge of the flats. Frank Harlan, a teamster with 4 heavy wagons and a crew of 8, secured rights to build a relay station at the hollow's midpoint. Within 2 months, 7 different men had staked claims on land along the flat crossing. The prices were not cheap, but the logic seemed unbreakable. The flats were level. The distance was short. Any wagon could make the crossing in a day. The road would practically build itself. Norah Prescott did not buy land on the flats. Instead, she rode west one morning with dust padding along beside the mare, and she spent 3 days following the edge of a narrow canyon that ran roughly parallel to the hollow, about 2 miles from its western rim. The canyon was not deep, perhaps 40 feet at its lowest point, but its walls were steep, and the trail along its edge was narrow and winding. Scrub juniper grew along the rim. Loose rock littered the slopes. She came back to Red Mesa and filed a claim on a thin strip of land, barely a quarter-mile wide, that ran along the canyon's eastern edge for nearly 4 miles. The price was low. Nobody else had wanted it. When word got around, the reaction was what she expected. "That canyon trail?" "Garrett," Loomis said, leaning against the rail outside the general store. "A man couldn't get a buckboard through there without snapping an axle. What's she planning to do with it? Graze goats?" Jonas Pettit shook his head slowly. "Shame. She seems like a sensible woman. Must have misjudged the lay of the land." Frank Harlan was more direct. He stopped Norah outside the post office one afternoon and told her, plainly, that she had made a mistake. "I've run wagons across worse ground than those flats," he said. "The hollow's solid, packed clay, hard as a barn floor. That canyon of yours, it's too narrow, too steep, and too far from the main line. Nobody's going to haul freight through there when they can roll straight across." Norah looked at him for a moment. Dust sat at her feet, watching Harlan with those amber eyes. "You ever cross the hollow in September?" she asked. Harlan frowned. "September's dry." "Not always," Norah said. She walked away. She began work on the canyon trail that same week. Every morning, before the sun cleared the eastern rim, she rode out with the mare and a set of tools: a pickaxe, a shovel, a pry bar, and a hand drill she had brought from Silver Falls. Dust walked ahead of her, picking his way along the rocks as if he had done it 100 times. The trail was rough. In places, rock slides had narrowed it to less than 6 feet. In others, the grade tilted sharply toward the canyon edge, and the ground was loose shale that shifted underfoot. No wagon could pass safely. Norah started at the southern end and worked north. She cleared rock by hand, rolling stones to the canyon edge and letting them tumble into the dry wash below. Where the trail was too narrow, she used the pry bar and drill to split larger boulders, breaking them into pieces she could move. Where the grade tilted, she built up the low side with packed rubble and tamped earth, creating a level surface wide enough for a wagon and team. It was brutal work. The sun hit the canyon rim by 9 in the morning and stayed until late afternoon, and there was no shade except what the juniper offered. Her hands blistered, healed, and blistered again. She wore through 2 pairs of leather gloves in the first month. Her shoulders ached so deeply at night that she couldn't sleep on her left side, and she learned to roll strips of wet cloth around her forearms to keep the tendons from seizing. She ate her midday meal sitting on whatever rock she had just moved, with dust beside her, sharing strips of dried beef. The mare stood patient in whatever shadow she could find, swishing flies and dozing with one hip cocked. Sometimes a canyon wren sang from somewhere below the rim, and Norah would stop chewing and listen until it finished. She kept a small leather journal in her saddlebag, and each evening she sketched the section she had worked, the width of the trail, the angle of the grade, the placement of drainage cuts. Thomas would have approved. He had always said that a person who didn't record their work was just guessing twice. Some days, riders from Red Mesa passed along the rim and stopped to watch. "Building a road to nowhere," one of them said, loud enough for her to hear. "She'll quit before August," said another. A third man, older, with a sun-cracked face and a plug of tobacco in his cheek, watched her split a boulder with patient hammer and wedge work and shook his head. "Stubborn as a railroad tie," he said. "I'll give her that." She did not quit. By the end of July, she had cleared and graded nearly a mile of trail. The surface was firm, the canyon's sandstone base drained well, and the rubble she packed into the low spots held solid even when she poured water over it to test. She had widened the narrowest sections to 12 feet and cut back the sharpest turns so a team of 4 could swing through without crowding. At the steepest points, she sank tall wooden posts into the ground along the outer edge, thick juniper trunks, stripped and squared, standing 6 feet high. She painted the tops with white lime so they could be seen from a distance, even in blowing dust. "What are those for?" asked a boy who had ridden out from town to watch. "So a driver can find the road when he can't see the ground," Norah said. The boy looked out at the wide, bright flats of Dust Hollow, shimmering in the heat. "Why would he need to?" he asked. Norah didn't answer. She drove the next post and moved on. By September, the merchants of Red Mesa were feeling confident. The rail depot at Alder Creek was open. The first freight contracts had been signed. Garrett Loomis had his warehouse framed and roofed. Frank Harlan had his relay station running, with fresh water and a corral for tired teams. Jonas Pettit had built a feed cache at the hollow's eastern margin. The flat crossing was busy. Wagon trains moved across it every few days, raising long plumes of pale dust that could be seen for miles. Drivers said the surface was perfect, hard, level, fast. A loaded wagon could make the full crossing in under 8 hours. Norah kept working. She had finished nearly 3 miles of improved trail along the canyon. She had built 2 turnout areas where wagons could pass each other, reinforced the steepest grade with a retaining wall of dry stacked stone, and cleared a wide staging area at the northern end where teams could rest and water from a spring that seeped from the canyon wall. Nobody used the trail. Prescott's Folly, Garrett Loomis called it. The name spread. Norah heard it. She said nothing. She knew what September could bring. Thomas had explained it to her once, on a winter evening in Silver Falls, while they sat beside the stove and he drew diagrams on brown paper. "A basin like that," he said, sketching the shape of a wide, flat depression, "looks solid because the surface bakes hard in the sun. But underneath, the clay holds moisture like a sponge. It doesn't drain. It just sits. And when heavy rain hits the highlands above the basin, the water has nowhere to go. It sheets across the surface and soaks in. Within hours, you've got 6 inches of mud that won't dry for days." "How do you know which basins do that?" Norah asked. Thomas smiled. "You look at the edges. If the drainage cuts run away from the basin, the water stays in. If there's no rock underneath, just clay, it holds. A basin like that can look like a highway in July and a swamp in October. Norah had ridden Dust Hollow 4 times before she filed her claim. She had studied the drainage cuts. She had dug test holes with a hand auger and found clay 18 inches down, dense and gray and slick as soap. She had climbed the low rises at the hollow's northern edge and seen the shallow channels where highland runoff funneled down into the basin. She knew what the hollow was. She just didn't tell anyone. The first storm came on September 14th. It built over the highlands in the early afternoon. A dark wall of cloud that climbed fast and hit the basin like a dropped curtain. Rain fell in sheets. Not the brief scattered showers that the desert usually offered, but a steady, driving downpour that lasted 4 hours and turned the sky the color of slate. By evening, Dust Hollow was unrecognizable. The hard-packed surface that drivers had praised all summer was gone. In its place was a flat expanse of gray-brown mud, thick and heavy, stretching from rim to rim. Water stood in shallow pools across the low spots. The wagon ruts from weeks of traffic had become channels that held the rain and softened the clay beneath. Where the surface had been firm enough to bounce a coin off, it was now soft enough to swallow a man's boot to the ankle. The smell changed too. The dry, mineral scent of baked clay was gone, replaced by something damp and sour. The smell of earth that had been sealed shut for months and was now breathing for the first time. Frank Harlan had a 6-wagon train halfway across when the storm hit. The lead wagon sank to its axles within an hour. The team strained and blew, hooves churning in mud that sucked at them like wet mortar. The driver cursed and cracked his whip and accomplished nothing. By the time the rain stopped, all 6 wagons were stuck fast, lined up across the hollow like ships frozen in ice. The men spent the night on the flats, sleeping in the wagon beds, listening to the mud settle and pop around them, watching the stars come out over ground they could not walk on. It took 2 days and 14 extra horses to pull them out. 2 of the wagon tongues snapped during the extraction. 1 horse threw a shoe in the mud and went lame. Garrett Loomis's warehouse, built on a foundation of packed earth, shifted 3 inches to the south as the ground beneath it softened. A crack opened in the east wall. Water pooled inside. Jonas Pettit's feed cache flooded. 400 pounds of grain turned to paste. And the second storm came 6 days later. This one was worse. The highlands had not fully drained from the first, and the runoff hit the basin in a single heavy surge. The hollow filled faster. Mud deepened. A freight company out of Alder Creek lost a wagon entirely. It sank so deep that the bed disappeared, and they had to abandon it and come back with a chain team a week later to drag it free. Trade between the 2 towns stopped. Merchants in Red Mesa gathered at Loomis's store and argued. Some wanted to wait for the flats to dry. Others said the season was too far gone. More storms were likely. Someone suggested building a corduroy road across the worst sections, but the cost of timber alone would eat a year's profit. Then someone mentioned the canyon. Prescott's trail, Jonas Pettit said quietly. Along the west rim. She's been working on it all summer. Garrett Loomis scoffed. That goat path? It's not a goat path, said a young driver named Tom Sutter, who had ridden past the canyon a few days earlier. She's graded it, widened it, put up guideposts. It looks like a proper road. There was a silence. Canyon rock drains, Pettit said. I'll say that much. Frank Harlan stared at the floor for a long time. Then he put on his hat and walked out. He found Norah at the northern staging area, filling a water trough from the spring. Dust was lying in the shade of a juniper, watching a lizard on a rock. The mare stood nearby, swishing flies. Harlan looked at the trail. It was not what he had expected. The surface was firm sandstone and packed rubble, sloped slightly toward the canyon to shed water. The guideposts stood in clean white lines along the outer edge, visible from a quarter-mile in any direction. The turns were wide enough for a full team. The grades, while steeper than the flats, were manageable. He could see where Norah had cut into the slope to ease the angle. "This is good work," he said. Norah poured the last bucket and set it down. "It's solid ground," she said. "Always has been. Canyon rock doesn't hold water. It lets it go." Harlan took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "I told you the hollow was solid," he said. "You did." "I was wrong." Norah looked at him. There was no triumph in her face, no satisfaction, just the steady, patient expression of a woman who had done her work and was ready for what came next. "I need to move 12 wagons through to Alder Creek by the end of the month," Harlan said. "Can this road handle that?" "It can handle more than that," Norah said. "But I'll need to set some rules, weight limits on the steepest sections, speed through the turns, no passing except at the turnouts. I've marked everything." Harlan nodded slowly. "What do you charge for passage?" Norah told him. It was fair, less than the cost of a single wagon stuck in the mud for 2 days. Harlan did not argue. He sent his first train through the next morning. The wagons moved, slowly at first. Drivers unfamiliar with the canyon trail gripped their lines tight and watched the guideposts like sailors watching a lighthouse. The turns felt narrow after the wide-open flats. The grade made the horses work harder, but the ground held. Every wheel rolled on solid rock and packed earth. No ruts formed. No mud pulled at the axles. When a brief shower hit on the second day, the water sheeted off the trail and dropped into the canyon below, and the surface was dry again within the hour. Tom Sutter drove the 4th wagon through and came back grinning. "It's tight," he said, "but it's honest ground. You know where you stand." Within 2 weeks, every freight company running between Red Mesa and Alder Creek was using Norah's trail. Wagon trains lined up at the southern staging area in the mornings, and Norah managed the flow, northbound in the morning, southbound in the afternoon, with rest stops at the turnouts and fresh water at the spring. She was there every day. She walked the line while wagons rolled, watching for loose rock, checking the guideposts, flagging any section where the surface had started to wear. When a driver took a turn too fast and scraped his wheel hub against a post, she replaced the post that same evening. When a section of retaining wall shifted after a tremor, she spent 2 days rebuilding it, stone by stone, while traffic flowed on the other side. Drivers noticed. They noticed that the road was maintained the way a good captain maintains a ship, not with grand gestures, but with constant, quiet attention. They began tipping their hats to her when they passed. Some left small gifts at the staging areas: a sack of coffee beans, a tin of tobacco, a bundle of candles. She hired 2 men from Red Mesa to help maintain the road, clearing rockfall, repairing the guideposts, grading the surface after heavy use. She paid them fairly and worked alongside them. She didn't supervise from horseback. She got down in the dirt and showed them what needed doing, and they respected her for it. Garrett Loomis came out to see the trail in early October. He stood at the northern staging area and watched a 12-wagon train wind along the canyon rim, the white guideposts marking the turns like a string of pearls against the red rock. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he walked over to Norah, who was checking a retaining wall where a stone had shifted. "I called this a goat path," he said. I remember. I called it Prescott's folly. I heard. Loomis looked at the trail again. A wagon was coming around the long southern turn, the driver holding his team steady, the guideposts bright in the afternoon sun. I was a fool, he said. Norah straightened up and wiped her hands on her trousers. You saw what the ground showed you in dry weather, she said. Most people do. The land doesn't lie, but it doesn't always tell you everything at once. You have to watch it in every season. That's all. Loomis nodded. He offered his hand. She shook it. He never called it Prescott's folly again. That winter, the storms continued, heavier than anyone in Red Mesa could remember. The flats stayed impassable from October through March. Garrett Loomis's warehouse sat empty and listing. Frank Harlan's relay station was abandoned, its corral posts leaning in the soft ground. But the canyon trail stayed open. Norah reinforced the worst sections with additional stone. She built a small shelter at the midpoint where drivers could warm themselves and rest their teams out of the wind. She kept the guideposts painted fresh so they caught the light even on the grayest days. Trade did not stop. Goods moved. Alder Creek grew. Red Mesa prospered. And every wagon, every crate, every sack of flour and keg of nails and bolt of cloth passed along 4 miles of canyon rim that belonged to Norah Prescott. By the following spring, the name had changed. People stopped calling it the Canyon Trail. They called it Prescott's Road. Jonas Pettit began building a new feed station at the northern staging area. Frank Harlan moved his relay operation to the southern end, where the trail met the main road from Red Mesa. A blacksmith set up a forge near the midpoint shelter, and a woman named Ada Clearwater opened a small provision shop beside it. The road became a place. Drivers knew every turn, every grade, every guidepost by sight. They talked about the trail the way sailors talk about a familiar channel, with respect and something close to affection. Norah trained 3 local men to manage the road when she was away. She taught them how to read the drainage, how to spot a weakening retaining wall, how to grade a surface so it shed water without losing its packed base. She taught them what Thomas had taught her. The ground tells you what it needs, she said. You just have to listen. She never raised her prices. She never turned a wagon away. She never reminded anyone that she had been right when they had been wrong. That wasn't the point. 12 years later, an old man named Harlan, not Frank, but his son, Tom Harlan, who had taken over the freight business, was sitting on the porch of the midpoint shelter with a cup of coffee, watching the morning wagons come through. The guideposts had been replaced twice by then, but they still stood white and tall along the canyon edge, and the trail was wider now, graded smooth by years of careful maintenance. A second provision shop had opened near the spring, and there was talk of building a proper inn at the northern staging area for overnight travelers. The road had changed the shape of commerce between Red Mesa and Alder Creek. 3 other trails had been attempted across the flats in dry years. Corduroy sections, gravel beds, even a raised timber causeway that lasted 1 season, before the clay beneath it shifted and the whole thing buckled like a broken spine. None of them held. The hollow remained what it had always been, smooth in summer, treacherous in storm, honest only to those who understood it. Prescott's road endured. Norah came walking up from the south with a dog at her side, not Dust, who had died peacefully in his 8th year, curled in a patch of sunlight beside the midpoint shelter, while Norah sat with her hand on his ribs and felt the last slow breath leave him. She had buried him on the canyon rim, under a juniper that leaned toward the morning sun, and she had not gotten another dog for nearly a year. But then Flint appeared, gray and amber-eyed, one of Dust's last pups, raised by a rancher's family south of Red Mesa. The rancher's wife brought her to Norah one morning and said, "She won't stop looking toward the canyon. I think she knows where she belongs." Flint was 3 now, lean and watchful, with the same quiet patience her father had carried. The dun mare was gone too, buried beside the trail she had helped build. Norah rode a sturdy buckskin gelding now, but today she was on foot, checking the posts. She was 38. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, and the lines around her eyes were deep from years of sun and wind. Her hands were harder than most men's, but she walked with the same steady patience she had always carried, and when she stopped to check a post, she tested it the same way, a firm push, a look at the base, a nod if it held. Tom Harlan watched her. "My father told me once," he said, "that you knew the hollow would flood before you ever filed that claim." Norah looked at him. Flint sat down beside her, watching a hawk circle above the canyon. "I knew the ground," she said. "That's all anyone can know." "He said you never told anyone. Would they have listened?" Tom thought about that. Probably not. Norah smiled, a small, quiet smile that she allowed herself more often now than she used to. "The land always reveals its secrets," she said, "but only to those who pay attention. Your father learned that. So did Loomis. So did everyone who watched the hollow fill up that first September. The knowing wasn't mine to give. They had to see it themselves." She tested the next post, found it solid, and moved on. Flint followed, padding along the canyon edge with her nose to the wind, and the morning light caught the white tops of the guideposts stretching north along the rim, steady and bright against the red rock, marking the road that one woman had built when everyone else chose the easier path. Tom Harlan watched her go. He thought about his father, who had stood on this same porch years ago and told him the story of the first wagons through, how the drivers had gripped their lines white-knuckled on those early runs, how the guideposts had seemed like the only solid thing in the world, how Norah had walked the trail every single day that first season, checking every post, every stone, every inch of grade, as if the road were a living thing that needed tending. She never once said, "I told you so," his father had said. Not once. And that's what made it stick. She didn't need to be right. She just needed the road to work. Behind her, the wide flats of Dust Hollow lay silent and pale in the distance, smooth as a promise in the dry morning air. A faint haze shimmered above the clay, and if you didn't know better, you might think it was the finest road in the territory. But Norah Prescott knew better than to trust smooth ground. She always had.